Thanks everyone for joining us today. I'm on unceded Gadigal land here in Sydney, and I'd like to acknowledge elders past, present, and emerging. And I'm really excited to welcome you this evening, or this morning if you're joining us from the other side of the world, to present the findings from this fantastic collaboration through the User-Centered Energy Systems Technology Collaboration Program under the IEA. Now, this has been a fantastic 2-year, 6-country effort with some 17 researchers working on some really fascinating and quite diverse cases in each of our countries. So I'm really excited to present the findings from today, and we're going to be focusing on the analytical dimensions of the final report, which you can find on our Users TCP website, userstcp.org. And there, for those with a more constrained schedule or who are averse to reading 200-page reports, we also have a 32-page version with a lot of fantastic graphics that's also available to download on our website there. Now, the plan for this evening is to run through each of the analytical dimensions of the project and then to open it up for discussion. Now, this in a nutshell is really what we did in the project. So there were some 26 case studies that we analysed, and these really spanned 4 broad areas of development or stages of development. Many of them were in the trial stage, but some of them were simply feasibility. So it was talking to people about a project like a virtual power plant, in the case of our Australian collaboration with Solar Analytics. And, that wasn't about a real virtual power plant, but about customer expectations. Many of the trial projects were at quite a small scale, some of them with only a handful of participants and some with tens or even hundreds of participants. And then there were larger scale demonstration projects. And then the largest project has literally tens of thousands of participants and is more or less part of the infrastructure in Southeast Queensland, which is the Peak Smart project. So we've got some really interesting lessons looking across these different forms and scales of automation and the many diverse participants and reasons for establishing automation across these different areas. And this on the left here is just a little graphic of some of the justifications for automation in each of these trials. Now, you can see this graphic is reproduced with a little more clarity in the executive summary and the final report. But you can see here that there are a number of reasons from peak shaving through to voltage management, through to balancing and frequency ancillary services, as well as participation in energy markets. So one of our main messages is that automation is not just one thing, that there are many justifications for automation, and having consumers understand the common problem to which automation is addressed is pivotal to building a social license. So if all of this works well, we have trust between consumers and energy companies, community capacity to manage disruptions is increased, and we have a more stable energy system and a more efficient energy system as well. So that's really big picture what we're hoping to support through this work. Now, we've broken down our key messages in the report, and there's some 18 of these listed in the exec summary. And I'll just run you through some of the standout ones for me. So this question of how shared problems are articulated is something that really came up over and over again in our discussions. So blackouts are a shared challenge and a shared problem for consumers. Greenhouse gas emissions present a problem for our shared environment and climate. So how the solution to these are articulated is pivotal to consumer acceptance of automation programs. Now, once these programs are set up, they ultimately need to integrate into household routines. So there's many different ways that can happen that we explore across the case studies. Another one of our key messages that we're really keen to discuss further are some of the tensions between the energy rationalities and the grid rationalities or aspects of automation. Now, these can pull in different directions. So there may be issues trying to synthesize these or trying to do too much with projects, and consumers may get wary, which can lead to social license issues. Now, there's also a value for industry and users that's realized in the trials that may not be realized in the scaling up. So, a lot of the projects used one off subsidies to pay for equipment, for example. So, the question of how that might translate into a wider business case needs to be taken with a grain of salt, and we need to be really careful with that. And the other message that I'd really select to highlight in our work is an ongoing need for social science. Now, it has an indispensable role, not just in the development, but in the ongoing operation and evaluation of automated DSM programs. So, this diagram to the left here is an overview of the conceptual approaches that we took in the project. And each of these four we'll hear a little bit more about today. And I've split these across two axes. The vertical axis here refers to formal rules. So if we assume that there are fixed and established rules about the energy system, then our institutional analysis is more suited to grappling with the challenges for these in the context of a social license. But when we're dealing with the practices of energy users and how they engage with the energy system, then we need a sociological lens or looking at the micro level of human-computer interaction. There's also a question about the object. If we think about these as the subjects of automation, there is a question about the object of automation. Is it something that's fixed and established in a project, or is it something that's still emerging? And this is the other axis here. When we assume that automation is already established in a program, then our human-computer interaction has some really valuable lessons. But if we're trying to establish automation into an existing set of social practices and trying to integrate it, then we need to take a much more fluid approach, which is where our energy sociology and energy activities approach has some really valuable lessons. So that's really a very high level summary of what we've done in the project. And there is, of course, much more work to do, which we'd like to talk about tonight. So one of the fantastic features of this team's facility is that you can come back to this slide and sort of have it as a note to refer back to. But there are some really important, outstanding areas for further research, and these include around the climate policy implications, how these new and emerging programs might relate to formal commitments under the UN, for example. There's also still many principal agent issues, for example, between householders who are renting and the owners of the house that still need to be addressed explicitly. We haven't tackled those in great detail in this work. There's also a lot of scope for feminist and post-colonial approaches to automation, and also looking at the cultural forces explicitly. We're also interested in developing further analysis of who is excluded from these trials and also who exits. So there's a kind of problem of omission here in amongst these trial participants. We don't know that much about why people leave trials or demonstration projects. And I think also with the mature projects, there's still quite scant data on why people are exiting. So some very important work there still to be done. And looming all over all of this, we have a bias towards trial and demonstration projects in our work. How will these scale? It's really the great question that our energy systems are facing. Markets are going to be one important answer to that, but I think our report has some really valuable social science answers as well. So I'm going to dive straight into our human-computer interaction findings. Unfortunately, Lisa couldn't make it today. She's our fantastic and really energetic colleague at the Austrian Institute of Technology, who really led this stream of analysis. And I'm really looking forward to seeing how Lisa's work in this space develops over the next few years. She's really brought a lot of just wonderful energy to the project and some really sharp insights that I'm hoping to share with you today. So the human-computer interaction component really sits in this bottom right quadrant of our analysis. And what we used to analyze the case studies in this component of the research was a breakdown of the levels of automation. So Lisa really looked at 15 of the case studies that were able to provide comparable data. And we looked at the low, medium, and high levels of automation as different categories that summarized these projects. And in the low level of automation, we were actually asking people to manually shift or program a device. At the medium level, there was still a kind of veto, but there was a greater level of automation. And then at the high level of automation, it was much more a matter of simply a background event that might happen to your appliance that you might be notified, but that you might be notified about. So these are demand side management events, DSM, that are being controlled in all of these scenarios here. So we're interested in how, under this stream of analysis, how the different interaction channels are used across the DSM projects, and also what works and what can be, further improved with better interfaces and better communication between automation providers and citizens. So this was really done as a comparison at the case study level here. There were a number of trials at across these different countries that we used, and what this led to was some really fantastic analysis of how different justifications were presented to different users. So were they presented with CO2 savings, like direct emissions reductions? Were they presented simply with monetary savings or some sort of voucher? So across these different categories, we see a range of different control options that were broken down for the user. And across these other different graphs here, you see just a description of how the different trials in the different countries were broken down as well. So there were also questions around how privacy was dealt with in these case studies, how frequent the interaction was, the extent to which there was gamification, and the extent to which people were given explicit comparison with their peers, essentially. So in Australia, we know this is now a feature of some bills that you get, you know, your comparable household would consume X kilowatt hours in this time. So that was really sort of really developed in many of the cases analysed as well. Now, the takeaway from this, and we had a fantastic question coming into this webinar about the amount of information that should be provided under different energy management service models. So this is this is really the stream of analysis that gives us really the best insight into that question. If you're trying to set up a new project, how much is too much, and what sort of information is necessary, and what should your information provision strategy be? So we've got quite a lot to say about that in the report. And at the high level, this is really what we found. So there's really different demands depending on the appliance, and not if you're trying to control an EV or an air conditioning system or a washing machine, each of those will have very different requirements for the extent to which people want to be notified, particularly about disruptions to their access to that service provided by those appliances. And there's also a question about how that's going to disrupt their daily routines. So in the report, we found there was no one size fits all, but there was some evidence of a hierarchy according to impact on users in terms of the information that you want to be providing about what the appliance has achieved in terms of the overall benefit for other users, when you might be wanting to control it, for example, during a peak event, and also, providing summaries of how it's been controlled over time. So, in this hierarchy of the impact on users, I can quote directly from the report here. The automation of loads associated with comfort or convenience, especially, is generally less acceptable to users, which makes sense. Loads with greater potential impact include washing machines and dishwashers, while loads with fewer potential impact include home batteries. So we actually need more research on this. But we also had some really important findings on the role of transparency in information provision, and shifting from one of our overall conclusions was that the role of transparency actually changes throughout the project. And in the beginning, information provision is really about helping and reminding and teaching. And it can also be about sort of providing encouragement, like, hey, you've participated in this and it's saved X tons of CO2, for example. And then it moves more towards reassuring and justifying and providing transparency and accountability. So that's a really important sort of trajectory over time when you're thinking about interactions. One of the things we also touch on is that people want to access information even if they're not looking at it. So you have to be really careful about those read receipts, because people might just want their own audit trail. And that's also a sort of culturally specific thing too. So if you've just arrived in a country, you might actually want to know more information about where your money's going or what this program is actually doing. Now, our report has some overall conclusions about how you should look at each of these different levels of automation. But at each of these levels, there is a need for clear and ongoing communication. So I would encourage you to have a look at that section, as it's relevant to many of our industry partners on the call. And with that, I will hand over to our colleague Cecilia, who is based in Sweden. And
so in this work stream, We dealt with energy activities, and we focused on these three major questions, or the major questions were that we wanted to explore what the energy using activities that people do in their homes, what these activities reveal about flexibility of energy use. How do they engage with automation technologies to allow for time shifting? And what is the potential of automated demand-side management to increase flexibility? We also looked at households' own programming of their smart home technology, if they had any, for energy efficiency, as well as automation from an external actor. So these are two different things. One is on their own initiative, and the other one is the automated control. Household activities that were highlighted in these studies were mainly EV charging and the use of household appliances. Cases contributing with observations to the work stream were from Australia, Norway, Sweden, Switzerland, and the Netherlands. The types of EV charging that households engage in may be described in relation to their aims. So this is a good way to categorize the EV charging activities. And these aims were listed, some of the examples are listed here in the slide. One example was to maintain the battery charging level to be nearly full. So the aim was that it would be nearly full all the time. And one aim was to charge when solar energy would be available. So this connected to the own production of energy in the household. And regarding the use of dishwashers and washing machines in the home, we could see a pattern where time shifting depended on needs, convenience, or costs. So these were three incentives that directed the time shifting. So finally, I'll do all these at once, I think. This is a brief summary, very brief summary of the conclusions from our studies regarding the potential of time shifting for our categories of energy activities. And this shows that households can time shift their energy activities. However, they will time shift. If they will time shift or not depends upon how to prioritize with the necessities of everyday life. And this is very important. Everyday life has a priority over time shifting. So this is illustrated with examples from EV charging on the left-hand side of the slide and from use of home appliances on the right-hand side. And I'm not able to read the quotes here, but they're very illustrative of needs taking over the priority of time shifting. So that's all from me. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thanks so much, Cecilia. And
so in this stream of the analysis, we were looking at the process of translation from the conception of an automated demand-side management project and its take-up by household participants. So we're interested in understanding which problems automated demand-side management presented as a solution to, how it's presented as a solution, how these framings have been articulated and by whom, and to what extent these framings align or fail to align with users' values and expectations. So we examined cases drawn from primarily the Norwegian and Australian contexts in three main categories of demand-side management projects: the direct load control of household appliances, smart EV charging, and virtual power plants. So the problems that automated demand-side management is directed towards across most of the case studies were challenges of grid management, as we'd expect, although there were some exceptions. For example, that the debate about the need for smart charging in homes in Norway has been framed primarily as one of fire safety, which has sort of affected the trajectory of the debate there. The automated demand-side management solutions presented as offering multiple and complementary benefits in each case, but with varying emphasis placed on the environmental and financial and community ends. A variety of what we term middle actors are involved in translating these solutions for energy users, and research on the experiences of these middle actors offers insight into what sorts of approaches are most appropriate to build a social license. So we didn't have much opportunity to do this among our case studies, unfortunately, to actually be speaking directly to those middle actors, and that's another area where we see room and need for further research in future. But those case studies where we did speak directly to those middle actors revealed that that they see that the success of this translation process depends on tailoring their explanations of the technologies to the needs of the household. So it's often a matter, for example, of company support staff or trial team members having direct contact with participants and sort of adjusting their explanation and kind of troubleshooting strategies to what households need in order to be most sort of effective. And another aspect of that is introducing technologies into the home gradually so that people have an opportunity to get used to them. And that's particularly the case if we're talking about the direct load control of appliances as part of a larger smart home energy management system. A couple of the trials found that they needed to not jump straight to directly getting, introducing remote control into households, that they got the households used to the idea that they could be managing, for example, themselves some of these appliances, and then start to choose the sort of parameters around which they would be comfortable with those appliances being controlled remotely. Energy users' willingness to participate in these sorts of programs depends on the extent to which these solutions align with their motivations and priorities around energy. So, for example, the analysis suggests that people who've purchased their PV system or battery for environmental or financial reasons may be willing to participate if in a VPP, if the VPP has been presented to them as a way to advance these values. But on the other hand, those who were primarily motivated to purchase a battery to achieve greater energy independence or security are more likely to see a VPP as undermining these objectives. And this was an interesting finding in particular because in the Australian context, of course, many people are at this stage investing in batteries for those independence and security reasons, and not primarily because it's a good financial proposition. And so we need to be wary in designing VPPs that we're not targeting people who are perhaps least open to participating in a VPP for those reasons. And that point about automated demand-side management being acceptable if it aligns with users' values and priorities also includes a potential for automation to relieve households of any energy management work that they'd prefer not to do. So, in other words, automated demand-side management can be more acceptable if it helps people out where they want help. So, for example, respondents were interested in smart EV charging, where they perceived it would assist them to charge their EVs renewably or cheaply with less effort directed towards coordination and monitoring. So if they're struggling to adjust their EV charging to when their PV systems generating power, the prospect of smart charging helping them out with that was appealing. But that's only the case for those participants who saw that charging as onerous, and many, or some, at least some who we spoke to, actually enjoy that task. And for them, the benefit of smart charging is not actually apparent. So the STS analysis reveals that the extent to which users see value in automated demand-side management solutions tends to be highly influenced by their understanding of demand-side management, why it's necessary, the challenges it's seeking to address. And the case studies examined in various ways how what we're terming grid sensitivity, or awareness of what's going on in the grid, can be increased as participants become more familiar with these challenges in the energy system, and how that in turn can make them more open to participation. So again, an example from a VPP study, we found that when we initially gave people a whole range of participation options and found that they were less willing to kind of allow access to their battery, and would require higher levels of compensation to do so. And then we talked them through some of the reasons why a VPP is a good idea, and once they sort of understood that and had the opportunity to ask them questions, we actually then showed them those same participation models, and most of the participants actually shifted their preference for participation and were more comfortable with the idea of giving up control. So it's that alignment of kind of common and individual values there. Another factor is the visibility of how their distributed energy resources is being controlled, and access to information is really important for many users, even if they don't actively or regularly use it. As Declan mentioned before, people often just like to know that it's there. That gives them sort of peace of mind, whether or not they're actively engaging it or with it or making use of it. We need to be careful that using information is not the same as, or rather, just because you're not using it doesn't mean you don't value it. It can actually be of value for more reasons than its use value, if that makes sense. And then finally, control over how DER is being orchestrated is really important. The ability to override or opt out of automation events is important for trial and program participants. We sort of knew that already. But we've sort of seen in these case studies how energy users want control that goes beyond the option to just opt out. They want control over the parameters of their participation, such as the timeframes or battery range within which their EV, for example, must be charged. And just finally, one thing that emerged in the case studies was what seemed to be a tension between the potential for automation to take work off the hands of households, but also to empower them to play a more active role in increasingly decentralized energy systems. So this idea that automation could be, taking work off our hands, but that it's also that these systems are also calling on us to be more active. And this seems to be a bit of a tension. Our analysis suggests that automated demand-side management has the potential to support either or both of these roles. But what's really crucial in both is that they can and they need to preserve a sense of control. So even those participants who want to hand over the work to an automation system can feel in control if they feel they've had control over what they're signing up to in the first place. And then similarly, of course, those participants who are more eager to be actively involved can sort of exercise a sense of agency through that. I'll leave it at that. Thank you very much.
Cheers. Thanks for that fantastic overview, Sophie, of some really important work. And for our final workstream analysis, we have Celine from Geneva, who
Hello.
really led our analysis of the institutional comparison between these case studies.
So good morning, everyone from Switzerland. It's 7:30 here, and thank you very much for having us here. So what I want to do now is let's look at from a bigger picture, because like we were dealing with more like households and practices. So what we're now seeing in this part of the world, and after our discussion with Sophie and Declan, it looks like similar things are happening in Australia, and due to decentralization of like with the distributed energy resources and digitalizations, we are here observing new business models are emerging to manage demands with new actors. Some roles are changing, and also new services are possible with smart meters and new platforms to manage the demand and also trade the demand, for example. So these points highlight the importance of governance of these decentralized flexibility resources on a larger scale than just within homes, with the increasing number of technologies and actors. So what I want to present shortly is the different institutional settings that we observed in different cases in automated demand-side management projects, and then the concept for social licenses. I believe it's in this analysis as the actors are now seeking new roles. And then the issue of flexibility, in my opinion, is actually getting much more complicated and complex. So by doing a case study analysis, we want to provide evidence on which actors are involved in automated demand-side projects in different countries, what roles and interests do various people, various actors have, and then the action they take in automated DSM projects and practices. And then for this analysis, we analyzed 5 Australian case studies, 4 from Austria, 3 from Norway, and 8 from Swiss case studies. Let me go. Okay, perfect. So what do we have in our case studies? Let's start with the end users with different interests and motivations. We have either energy communities, which is much more common in Europe, which could be cooperatives with the interest of increasing their self-sufficiency. And then we also have the other end users, prosumers, consumers with different motivation and interests, cheaper electricity, high self-sufficiency, etc. But my observation is definitely their sole role is, or at least what the stakeholders, other stakeholders expect from them, is just to accept the automation, be passive, but don't worry, we won't impact your comfort, etc. Then we have the grid operators, which are DSOs, we call them distribution system operator, and the NSP in Australia, which are in charge of distribution networks. And they are in these projects because with the increased PV, EV, and heat pumps here, they either started to have local congestion problems or voltage problems in their distributed networks, or they know they will have these problems really, really soon with the increasement of these low carbon technologies, which means their role is expanding from distributing the electricity from the transmission lines to end users, but now have to directly manage the systems matching the demand with stochastic distributed resources. And of course, automated demand-side management offers more certainty in the amount, time, and location of the flexibility, because this is exactly what they need when there is a physical or operational problem in their grid and it is needed to be solved immediately. So they normally team up with technology providers, which they could tell or turn on appliances to avoid high stress, or turn off several heat pumps on EVs if there's a load congestion exceeding the physical hosting capacity. So if they don't do this, the demand-supply matching, it means that they will have to reinforce their grids, which is upgrading or even changing these transformers. And this could cost, this estimated cost could be billions for example, the European countries. We also have new emerging actors, which we call them aggregators. So they aggregate flexibility, the so-called, okay, I will make my pool of customers which consume electricity, or make them consume electricity, or curtail their demand depending on the needs or at the interest of my collaborators, and get money from them for doing this balancing service for them. And these aggregator groups do not even have to be physically in the country. For example, because everything is virtual. For example, we have a case in Switzerland. The aggregator is in Slovenia, but he controls everything via the internet in Switzerland. So these actors mostly team up with as flexibility providers for retailers and shift electricity according to this different market situations. And then they make money because they help these services like utility services from different numbers of customers. And in Switzerland, we also have one case that they don't even need the utility. They have enough, almost 6,000 heat pumps and electric boilers, and they do these ancillary services for the Swiss grid, which is the TSO of the transmission system operator of the country. And then they do services like frequency containment, etc. So what we observed is at the end is in a nutshell is that there is a coalition of stakeholders in the project. We rarely see any case that there is one actor that does everything, either with aggregators or with technology providers, where they at the end buy their energy management systems or not, or they continue with the contracts. Perhaps I already explained in a sense that the actors, hence their interest and hence their actions, are completely separated. We've noticed that if you're a DSO, all you think about the design of the automated DSM is according to the network needs. If you're a retailer and you're focused on how much you save from the electricity market, without considering whether you use the PV, local PV, or your load shifting, push the limits of the hosting capacity of the distribution network, you don't know. Because their algorithm really considers the electricity to use it at the cheapest spot. But if in the future, if thousands of them in a local network does that, these actions actually maybe could cause like a problem in the local consumption. So there was only one study who was considering this different ranking or precedence of different situations that it might arise from the automated demand side management. So in a summary, I can say that these business models that solely depend on their optimization on the energy market will not solve the problems of the local grids. And then these calls for, like, in my opinion, like separate platforms and harmonized frameworks to have integrated solutions where different interests and goals are aligned on a district and city level. And lastly, we know that in Europe and Australia, the grid operators, although they're the ones who are going to have most of the problems in the future, they don't have an access to a lot of information in the households. So they only have a power readings, for example, like on an aggregated scale. But if they want to do more granular automated demand side management, they should also need to have an access on, like, for example, charging patterns and heating patterns to bring better automated demand side management projects that are aligned with what people are asking or expecting. So yeah, I think that's all from me. And then thank you very much for listening.
That's fantastic. Thanks so much for that, Celine. A really important stream of work there, and I think really the vision that you present there, I think, has some incredibly valuable, some really valuable insights for the Australian setting, where we're going to be confronting the massive scaling up of different kinds of aggregation. I mean, so a lot of our partners and many people on this call are, I would argue, participants in different kinds of aggregation companies or companies that are starting to develop aggregation services. So yeah, I think there's a really interesting discussion there to be had around what we mean by an aggregator, and what we can learn from each country about what is developing as an aggregator, perhaps as a new kind of regulated entity or not in the energy system. So I guess the first thing would be to open it up for questions of clarification, if anyone has any. And then it'd be terrific to have a wider discussion about the many issues that we've touched on this evening. So if anyone has any shorter questions, maybe something you are holding back from the chat that you'd like to ask, please do speak up. Okay, I've got plenty of Dorothy Dixes ready and waiting. So one of the concepts that Celine, you talked about there was this idea of energy communities, and some of our case studies were really explicit examples of those. Now, we do have a community energy discourse in Australia. There are different models for building wind farms, for getting solar panels on the roofs of community facilities like a bowling green. I actually get a very small investment return for some money I put into putting solar panels on a local brewery. These are sort of forms of community energy, I guess, but it does seem like the energy community discourse is much more developed in many ways in Europe. So the Lugagia community, for example, what can you tell us about how that project started and the role of ENSPs in that?
Yeah, it's actually the project is started thanks to the DSO and the municipality there. So the DSO has already started to have some voltage problem because it's a community which a lot of people have their own PV in their house, and then there's a school with a creche, we call it a kindergarten, sorry, that has a PV on it, but it's closed in summer. So that PV is not self-consumed, let's say. And then the people of the community, Lugaggio, they go to work in the urban cities. And then there is a problem there, of course, like this, there is this huge high PV supply that the DSO doesn't need because there is no demand. And then the whole idea, like the DSO and municipality come together and they say, like, we should do something here. And then people are like also a very closed relationship as well. And then they're like neighbors and all that. And then they decided to form this community all together. Like DSO is one of the, let's say, the investors there. And then the whole idea is like having a decentralized battery. The communication was always like, okay, we need to increase the self-sufficiency. DSO has a narrative that, okay, if we can increase this self-sufficiency, which I will even invest a decentralized battery for you, which I will pay, I will also solve my grid problems because you are creating a grid problems. So this is how the project started, and people are very happy with it because they can see, I mean, this visualization thing that we were also discussing with Lisa, that they in this interface, they not only see their individual consumption and production, but they also see as a community, one smart meter that shows like, okay, that's the consumption and production plus the percentage of self-sufficiency. So people are very happy. Of course, there are still some self-sufficiency problems because demand supply matching is not that easy. But now they're connecting to another gym, which they can consume electricity in the morning. So it's a very nice, I have to say, project where they try different things like multi-energy or sector coupling with the people there. So it's one of the really interesting projects. And then the problem of like not caring about local production but using cheap electricity, they solve it because then they first used local PV, which they created a cheaper market in the community, and then they solve the problems of grid and market, whichever. So it's very, very interesting, and I think it will be a really nice, let's say, a model for Switzerland, because wherever I explain this Lugaggio innovation community, everybody is like very interested.
Yeah, and they've. Can you tell us how the battery was introduced into that? Because that seems like quite an important component to this, that you have a community battery and that can absorb some of this variability.
Yeah, they introduced it as like, yeah, we're going to increase your self-sufficiency. And then the battery works really, it charges when the consumption of the community is less than the PV, and then it discharges, it's in the opposite way. But then the whole introduction was like, yeah, it will increase your self-sufficiency, and we will show it how it's done. And then it exists in their interface. Let's see.
Yeah, I think it is such a fascinating example of what can be done. And I guess there's also, with some of the other case studies in Switzerland, there's a kind of market layer that gets added as well.
Yeah.
And yeah, could you say a little bit about the innovative self-consumption model that has a transactive sort of dimension that includes some blockchain components, I believe?
Yeah, exactly. So in this Lugaggio, and then there's another case study that they tried the blockchain technology, which then they try to do everything decentralized. But the whole point of the project is like the DSO is investing in it, which decentralized management is actually opposite what they want, because they want everything to be centrally, let's say, managed. But they're looking at different options and say if it's much cheaper or if it's much more effective than what they're doing. Because they have, for communities, I think Lugaggio is like 17 households, the creche, the kindergarten, and the gym. And I think Cartier-Strom is like 27 households. So, of course, DSO has to do hundreds and thousands. And if they can find out that these blockchains can decentralize, manage much more effective than the DSO, indirectly they will have the benefits for their grids. So they both invested in this blockchain technology, even though it's completely decentralized. They're supporting the opposite, let's say, actor. So, but it's what, for me, like the community feeling in Switzerland is quite vivid. So once you explain these things, okay, you're going to increase the community, you will do the transaction between the members of the community, people really like it. And people really see a value in it. And then this is how it started. I think it will go to many communities in Switzerland. Now there are 800 communities like this with a PV on top with no energy management systems. But a lot of DSOs, like they're seeing as like a potential customers, because they're also the early adopters. Let's say that they're already in the discourse of energy transition because they have a PV on top. So they're seeing like they could be like a really nice potential customers. Questions coming.
Yeah, we've got a question from Wendy Russell, my colleague down in Canberra. Hi, Wendy.
Hi, sorry, just unmuting and videoing on. So I'm really interested if you guys looked at issues of equity in your projects. We've been looking at neighbourhood batteries, and that raises some interesting kind of prospects for energy equity, which are a little different for the projects that you were looking at. But if any issues around equity came up, that'd be really interesting. And also interested in whether you looked at gender dimensions, particularly in relation to sort of procurement versus kind of integration with household practices and so on. There's quite a lot of really interesting work going on in that, and a special edition coming out soon next year about that.
Oh, in which journal?
Oh, I forget the name of it. It's an architecture building.
Oh, yeah, it's BRI, I think maybe. Yeah, building research. Yeah, anyway. Yeah, okay. No, those are fantastic questions. So questions around equity and around sort of feminist and some of the household labor distribution issues. I mean, on the equity side, it wasn't an explicit focus of the project. We did run with the trials in the sense that we took our point of departure in the people who had already signed up with the trials. So we don't have really good evidence on who didn't sign up for trials. I think there's some really interesting equity questions that are raised by a lot of the projects that we looked at, and I think that's also true of the rollout of air conditioning in Australia, for example, how subsidies work for or against that. But that really wasn't the sort of main focus of the analysis that we did.
So, Declan, I just wondered if that came up in your conversations with users and so on, whether that was an issue for them at all.
Yeah, look, it certainly has come up in a lot of the user interviews that we've done. And I think also the polling that Energy Consumers Australia has commissioned, I think it shows really strongly that when you ask people about, yes, that's a very good point, Celine. We actually have an explicit task running parallel to this one that's started just after ours, looking explicitly at gender and energy as well. So I would encourage anyone working on that to contribute and to get in touch with the task leads for that project, because I think there'll be some really interesting cross-country insights. But yeah, on the equity side, yeah, certainly the polling out of the Energy Consumers Australia, and I know we have one of the representatives with us today. They have some really important and really substantial findings on people's desire for equity in the energy system. Of course, you can ask people and they can say that, but then how that translates through these projects, I think, is a really, really important question to be dealt with by social scientists as these things progress, because of course the best laid plans need to be translated as they go forward. Yeah, on the household activity and other streams, perhaps Cecilia and Sophie, is there anything you wanted to add to that?
Yes, I just posted in the chat. I think these questions are very interesting, and we noticed in the case study in Sweden, we had a focus on differences between households. And when we tested the visualization service provided by the energy company to the households, we noticed that this was only accessible to the person in the household who was responsible for paying the bill. And it might seem like a small thing, but in the long run, this is democracy issues, I think. So that's one observation that we made. And if I just may continue, there's another thing related to the people being in charge of the technology in the home, which is mostly a male responsibility. And if programming and that sort of activities, if the household's activities are dependent on programming, this may also have consequences for the distribution of power within the household. So this is a speculation.
I might just add to that on the issue of equity, that as Declan said, it did come up in our Australian interviews, that these questions about who was going to benefit, who might get left out if they weren't able to participate in some of these programs, if they don't have the technologies, for example, they don't have a battery in order to be able to participate in a virtual power plant, and that could widen existing equity issues. Like, people are, I think, aware of those sorts of things, and they raise them with us. To my mind, one of the big kind of questions that we still need to kind of grapple with in this space is that one of the main incentives to participate in these sorts of programs is a financial one. So we've talked a bit about some of the other things that, a shared understanding of challenges to be addressed and those sorts of things, which can add to that rationale and sort of get people on board. But people also, the sense of being fairly compensated for their participation is an important aspect of this, we found across the board. And so there is that need for the financial compensation, which suggests that you would be better off being in a program than not being in a program. And yet, on the other hand, there's the imperative to make sure that people aren't sort of worse off for not participating at all. And I'm not quite sure how we actually reconcile that. I mean, this is a bigger question than the design of these specific programs, but I think that's something that needs to be sort of tackled still.
Yeah, I mean, and that's exactly, I think, where future research can contribute. One of the projects I'm going to be starting next year and doing some pilot work later this year is looking at existing ventilation practices in households. Like, what are people doing who don't have access even to air conditioning to keep themselves cool in summer in Western Sydney, where it gets extremely hot? We just had one of the hottest recorded temperatures in an urban area ever in Penrith just a couple of years ago. So there's really a need to kind of understand just at the level of the built environment what is already being done and how access to common spaces, not just private households, that are cool enough for people to withstand the temperatures that are coming and indeed already here. That's the sort of ongoing need, I think, that needs to happen at the level of energy planning, and I don't think it is happening at the level of energy planning and wider planning. And yes, of course, I would also just emphasize Rishab's point about early adopters of electric vehicles who are overwhelmingly, and this was actually quite a uniform finding across the countries, overwhelmingly male, high income, and they all have access to private garages and off-street parking largely. And that really shapes how this imagination of the future of the city is being rolled out as well. And there's some really important equity implications for other modes of transport and how the future of the built environment is being shaped around the private electric vehicle. And I would also just quickly add to Sophie's point here about people's motivations for participating in these trials. Yes, they want to be fairly compensated, but the other thing that really struck me in our interviews was people's real passion about climate change, that people actually saw their participation in this as part of the energy transition, really, and they really wanted to contribute to the problem of getting off coal and helping renewables. So I think that needs to be really appreciated, that narrowly framed sort of economic incentives are really unlikely to be enough. That continuing to talk about the common problems we face, whether it is at the grid level or whether it is at the larger level of climate change, is a really important thing for technology providers to continue doing. Now, do we have any other lines of questions there, or any further comments from anyone that you'd like to add? Because I'd love to talk more about some of the engagement practices at the level of the DSOs as well. I think we've had a lot of really interesting trajectories and developments in the ways that distribution companies have tried to get across this language of being customer centered, or they've been trying to find new ways of engaging with customers, and that includes commissioning social scientists to work for them. So I was really interested in how our international collaborators, and this may be a question for you, Cecilia, how have you seen the development with your industry partners over recent years to become more engaged with customers? Do you feel like it's become more pronounced over time? And what sorts of engagement are they doing?
Well, I think the interest might have increased, but it's not, I would say it's not put in practice yet. I think they're sort of thinking about how to form strategies, but they're not actually at the point of forming these strategies to get people involved in for instance, the design of the implementation of new technology like the smart metering in the households. So I think there's a lot to do for researchers like us to address these issues with the industry partners. Well, I would say that we need a lot of patience, because they're so different. They're used. The industry is very technology driven, so it's we really have to find ways to communicate with the stakeholders in order to persuade them, or to communicate why these issues are important and what are the consequences if you don't involve the private households or other types of customers in this issues.
Yeah, absolutely. So certainly in Australia, the language of being customer centric is something that we have 22 DSOs in Australia, or network businesses, and there was a really explicit shift in the language of being customer centered around 2015, when the peak body started to issue reports with that language being really front and center. And we've now reached the point this year where the regulator is starting to find ways of recognizing what good customer engagement looks like at the federal level. So that for me has been a really interesting journey to watch. And I think actually we have in our case studies some really interesting material to push that discussion even further. So a lot of the really high quality engagement has been quite modest, actually. I think it's been finding ways to aggregate opinion of consumers, and it's been about talking to people about plans largely. But I think some of the case studies that we've seen have taken that a lot further, right? It's actually going to people in their communities. It's working with them on the local problems that they find and collaboratively coming up with solutions. So I think that's a really interesting sort of trajectory or perhaps potential future there. And yeah, we've got some great comments and questions in the chat here. Just quickly for Rashab, the aggregator roles, I think they are definitely both the startups and existing retailers and DSOs, definitely. And a question here from Rob. Perhaps Cecilia and Celine and or Rashab, you may have an insight into this. Do European consumers know who their distributor is? Does anyone want to take that?
Maybe some of the others, but from the Dutch ones, quite often no. So they know who their energy provider is, but that's decoupled from the one who is in charge of the distribution network. And then there are not really so many at the national level. There are about 10 of them, but consumers usually don't know who it is.
Yeah, I guess in the Swiss examples that it may have changed with some of these highly engaged community projects. I don't know whether Celine, you've got any insight into that.
Yeah, so in Switzerland, it's still, let's say, it's unbundled inside, but a company could have the retailer, DSO, and then the supplier role. But in Switzerland, I would say people know their utility company and then distribution system operator, because there is, I think, almost like 400 of them in Switzerland. This tiny, because it's local companies. So people know here for sure. And then in our case studies, I think I showed 8 of them, and 8 of them, they were recruited by the DSO, actually. It wasn't through the university. So people know, I would say, here.
Fascinating. Yeah, it's quite a different history of building infrastructure, I guess, with at the local level. Yeah. And then we've got Wendy's question here. How is automation interacting with time of use pricing? Oh, that's a big one.
Maybe I can answer it again for the EV space from the Netherlands. So a lot of it is to do with apps. So right now, it's already commercial, and the first few entrants to the market, and there are a few business models. So one of them is something called Jedlix, which was started a few years back. And what they do is they communicate directly with the original equipment manufacturers of your car. So if you drive, say, certain models or vehicles, they have a connection with the rectifier, which is there at the entrance of the plug point of your car. So they know and can control the amount of electricity that you charge, and it's controlled through the vehicle. You can see that, and you can adjust it to some extent, or you can ask someone to adjust it for you. The second one is where they control the charge point, which is a slightly different business model. and that's a bit more complicated, but then usually it's integrated with your household energy bill, particularly if you're charging at home. But it can also be in a public space with certain charge passes that you get to use public charging infrastructure. And the third one, maybe the most complicated but also interesting one, is the one done by leasing companies. So they lease you electric vehicles, and because they kind of have control of the whole leased fleet, they're able to be independent participants in the energy market as long as they have the whole fleet to play with, more or less. That's more or less how it's working. And depending on the skill that they have, they're either able to have a portfolio completely off electric vehicles, or are able to link it up with say power plants they also have in their portfolio to play in energy markets. The difficulty is getting to the minimum bid size in terms of volume, but with scaling, it's getting there.
Yeah, there's a really interesting question that, or sort of discussion that Rishab and I have been having, that really around the extent to which energy is going to follow telecommunications in this sort of bundling question, and yeah, how basically all of those different issues around voltage management, participating in future markets, dealing with frequency services, how they might actually end up being bundled together in a package, and consumers don't see that side of it, but they just see a service that is presented to them. That may well be quite a compelling future for some people in the energy market, or some consumers, I should say, who want the service that is provided by a vehicle to grid set of payments, for example, and they are sort of the recipients of some sort of retail pricing. And then all of those questions around time of use are dealt with by the aggregator, basically at the aggregated level. So yeah, I think again this raises really profound equity issues, potentially, if that becomes the sort of default. Yeah. And Celine, did you have anything to add around that, around time of use pricing? I know you've been doing a lot of really important work around that.
Yeah, we had one case study. He was doing a real-time pricing, which was dynamic pricing. It wasn't only like two slots of time of use, but of course, every time it was told to the end users whether if you are worse off in this project, the DSO will pay you. There's a compensation for that, and then luckily it didn't happen in most of the cases, let's say, because it makes sure the optimization of the algorithm for the automation was always to the cheaper side. For sure. I mean, like Sophie said, like this benefit of costs, it's always communicated as like let's say not as the rationale of this why there is automation, but there's like a side benefit that people know once something is automated, it's going to the cheaper slot. And I think almost most of the cases is like this time of use planning in the project. Yeah.
Yeah, that's really fascinating. Yeah, it's I think just a really just such a kind of fertile area to think about how prices are not just an expression of the market, but they're actually a kind of bolt-on to the ways the energy system has been managed over a long period of time. And prices are historically quite a late entry to energy systems in the way that they're talked about these days. So yeah, I think it's definitely something that needs analysis, not just from economists to come up with optimal pricing, but social scientists to think about prices as kind of collective devices for managing when people do things and how they do things. Now, are there any final questions that anyone wanted to that anyone wanted to raise? I know, Kevin, you're doing some really important work in the policy space around vulnerability and measures of inequity. Did you want to say anything about that to the wider group? And maybe we can draw on some of the analytical perspectives to open that up.
I can briefly say something if you like on that. We've had, I'm sure we'll all be happy to hear that we've commissioned work from social scientists for the Australian government, which actually all of the Australian governments, of which there are 9, to try to understand energy hardship. That's what we've decided to call it. It's the best phrase to use in Australia. Because we were aware that many of the programs, and I don't think this is peculiar to Australia, were not actually providing the support needed for the people that most needed the support. And so we've been looking into understanding not just what causes energy hardship, but what there are different levels of energy hardship and different types of support needed by people depending on their different circumstances. And we're also looking at how to, having understood that from a lived experience perspective, how do you measure it? Is it possible to actually measure it? We know it's more than income and energy bill indicators that we need to actually understand it better. But unless we can measure it and track it, it's very hard to understand what's working and what's not. So that on that side, that's what's going on, and happy to keep people updated. I think it's very exciting work that we're doing. Very lucky to actually be able to get that up, I think. So yeah, happy to, if anyone has any questions, happy to answer them. But we've done phase 1 work. We have some conceptual frameworks which have gone down well with the people we've shared them with. And the next phase of the work is actually looking to go into households who we think may be in these different types of hardship and understand their circumstances better and try to actually and flesh out these frameworks so we can clearly identify the difference between the different types of hardship and understand ways that you can best help people navigate their way out of it. And a lot of this isn't about helping people to navigate their own way out of it. It's about actually getting them out of it, because as I'm sure you understand, a lot of people who are actually suffering some more extreme hardship are they just need taking out of the hardship.
Absolutely. Yeah, I think it's really important work, Kevin. There's one of the areas of the project that might be of interest is one of our concepts that we used throughout the work was what we called grid sensitivity. Now, I guess this idea of hardship is often translated as just as a financial or an income thing, which of course is going to be a really important part. But certainly the extent to which people are sensitive to the vulnerability of the grid around them is a really important predictor of the overall acceptance of these more advanced and high-tech automation systems and services. That's a theory that we're or that I'm testing with the survey data through ECA and some other data sources. But that's a quite a robust finding, and this came from this fantastic concept from our Norwegian colleagues, from Mariana Rukhaug and Ida Marie. This idea of grid sensitivity. So that may be a kind of underappreciated component of hardship. People getting blacked out on the end of swirl lines and that sort of stuff. I'm also mindful that we've got a limited amount of time, and Murray's asked this really fantastic and important question on the kinds of entities that are best placed to do aggregation. Now, one of the really important emerging findings, I think, from the project was that consortiums actually did really well. So the Lugagia project that Celine spoke to was actually quite a broad consortium that included technology developers as well. So collaborating, I think, actually has some really strong benefits. And the other side to that, I think, is clarity around articulation of the problems that you're solving. So in some senses, well, there is definitely more work that needs to be done on the relationship between the organizational form and the problem, but actually just being clear about the problem that you're solving, regardless if you're a financial corporation or a local council or whatever, will really help with the establishment of your trusted status as an aggregator. I think that's quite a robust finding in our cases. So thanks both for those questions.
Just a quick point, Declan, I'm hoping to be able to test that in an experimental survey with my researcher hat on in January. So
it's a perfect question for it. Yep, really perfect.
You know, does it actually change the acceptance if you tell them they can be part of solving some problems? Because the other side of that is that people don't actually think they should be part of solving that problem, and I think this is that big difference between that you point to in terms of whether early adopters are not only more sensitive to these things and more knowledgeable and less financially sensitive about the issues, they may just care more too. And may think that they want to be part of the solution. As a lot of people, particularly in Australia, as you all know, will think it's not their problem. But we'll see. I've got a big longitudinal survey panel to have a go at that on, so again, can let you know what happens.
Yeah, I think you're touching on some really interesting kind of causal pathways that need to be investigated further, and yeah, obviously some really important work to be done in this space still, trying to test what in statistical terms we'd call the moderating or the mediating factors there are in a social license. So yeah, that's fantastic. Now I'm mindful of time and I'm mindful of people's next meetings and their dinner plans. So if there are any final comments that anyone wanted to add, please throw them in the chat or do speak up. But otherwise, I will thank you very much for your attendance this evening and for, I think, a very enlivening and rich discussion. For all of our industry partners who were able to come along, and to the many who weren't able to come along tonight, of course, this project could not have proceeded without you. I did some back of the envelope calculations and came to the conclusion that we had about 6,000 people who filled in surveys or responded to requests for focus groups or interviews across all of our different case studies, or who were kind of active qualitative participants in the research. So this project wouldn't exist without their generosity and their time and their expertise, really. And of course, to all of our fantastic industry partners for responding to our many emails and for many incredibly enlivening conversations as well. So this is, I think, a real milestone in the project. Of course, this is what we're calling the final report, but there is, of course, much more work to be done. I'm hoping to visit some of my colleagues on this call next year. And we also have a special issue slated for the journal Energies. So please look out for that. So thank you, everyone. And I will see you all again in the future. So thanks again. And yeah, please do forward our full report and our findings on to anyone you think would find value in it. So thanks all.
Thank you all.